Madam President, I thought those remarks beautifully described a great public servant, George Voinovich. I'd like to add a little to it, and then at the end of my remarks, I'm actually going to offer a resolution for the entire Senate to vote on as a tribute to the life of George Voinovich. We have put together a resolution which talks about a lot of his accomplishments, and as I think my colleague has said very well, gives us an inspiration for the future, that from his life, hopefully we can learn about how to better do our jobs right here in the floor of the United States Senate. He was an amazing public servant. I mean, he was, as some know, not just mayor of Cleveland during a critical time, but also governor of Ohio, of course, a senator here for 2 terms. And I think he represented the very best of public service. And by that I mean that whether it was his efforts to tackle the debt, give children more choice and parents more choice in their schools, modernize infrastructure, he never made it about him. It was always about others, and specifically it was about his constituents. He was a very proud grandson of immigrants, Serbian and Slovenian. He was also the son of a great neighborhood in Cleveland called Collinwood, where I was over the weekend visiting with Janet Voinovich, and he was raised with the values of that neighborhood. Honesty, integrity, hard work. He said that his father used to tell him that in America we have more of the world's bounty than any other country on earth because of our freedom. Because, and I quote, we get more out of our people through the free enterprise system and our education system, end quote. He never forgot those early lessons. And wherever he went, whatever title he had, he was always that same earnest, plain-spoken kid from Collinwood. As a boy, he was diagnosed with a bone marrow disorder, which kept him from enjoying many of childhood's joys, like sports. He didn't let it get him down. In fact, he brought all of his energy into his studies. One reason he was such a good student, I think. And he got around Cleveland on his red bike, which he called Bessie, which was his pride. Later in life, by the way, I had the opportunity to be in parades with George Voinovich, and I'd be marching along, and there he was on his bicycle. I don't know if it was named Bessie, but I know that Janet Voinovich was at his side riding that bicycle in parades. Then Governor Voinovich, then Senator Voinovich. He loved those bicycles, always with a smile on his face. That difficult healthcare struggle that he had early in his life, I believe, shaped his character. It gave him a heart for all those who were suffering or who were just different. With so many of his decisions, he would go to the Lord for inspiration, start with a humble prayer. And he did this at Collinwood High School. He said he prayed for guidance, asking God what he should do with his life. And he got an answer. He felt he had a calling, and that was to get involved in student government. And so he ran. And he was elected class president as a senior. He went on to serve as student body president at Ohio University when he was in undergraduate school. And he was president of his class and president of the Young Republican Club while in law school at The Ohio State University. So people wonder, how did he get into politics? It all started in high school and through college and law school. That was the track he chose for himself. Over half a century, he served his neighbors in so many different roles, local, state, federal. He was a county commissioner in Cuyahoga County. He was county auditor. He was mayor, as we'll talk about. He was a state representative. He was an assistant attorney general. He was lieutenant governor. He was governor for 2 terms. He was the United States senator for 2 terms. This is the guy who devoted his life to public service. In 1959, as a young man, he volunteered for the mayoral campaign of a guy named Tom Ireland. We don't remember much about Tom Ireland because Tom Ireland lost. But George Voinovich won because in that election, he met a young woman, a beautiful and intelligent fellow volunteer named Janet Allen. Janet and George were married for more than 50 years. Having just been with her over the weekend, she is an extraordinary woman. And their relationship, their partnership, is a real model and example for all of us. And certainly it has been over the years for Jane and for me. George used to say about Janet, she was God's greatest blessing on me. And that was clear to anyone who knew him. Together they had 4 wonderful children, George, Betsy, Peter, and Molly. He was lieutenant governor in 1978 when his true calling came. And I say true calling because this was a time of urgency in his hometown of Cleveland. It was in trouble. That same year, Cleveland had become the first American city since the Great Depression to default on its debt, which by some measure totaled more than $100 million, which was a lot of money back then. People were worried. Some people were leaving the city altogether. From his neighbors and from his conscience, George Voinovich heard the call to come back home. Shortly after he won that Republican nomination for mayor, tragedy struck the Voinovich family. George's youngest daughter, Molly, was hit by a car. She was walking home from school. She was 9 years old. It's a tragedy no parent should ever have to endure. But George and Janet endured it, and turning to their faith, they persevered. They went on to win that election. George says that through that trial, his faith deepened even further, and his compassion for others grew even stronger. Sherrod Brown just talked about the fact that he said, things come into focus when you lose a child. I think that's what you said. And that's how he felt. It deepened his faith and brought things into focus. He did win that mayoral election, and he turned Cleveland into the comeback city. It was not an exaggeration, I don't think, to say that he personally saved the city from default, in the sense that he had incredible energy and infectious optimism that it could happen, sheer force of will, a great work ethic, and he brought people together. Having talked to some of the city fathers at that time, some of whom are still with us, it was George Voinovich bringing a team together that saved the city of Cleveland. He lifted people's hopes. A decade later, it was the entire state of Ohio that needed to be turned around. After winning re-election in Cleveland as mayor by 2 landslide votes, he was elected governor in another landslide. Ohio was facing a massive debt, just like Cleveland had been. George came to the rescue again, saying he would get the state government working harder and smarter, doing more with less. Anybody who knew George Voinovich knew that was his favorite motto, doing more with less, working harder and smarter. And with God, all things are possible. He did do more with less. He cut taxes by $24 billion to get the economy moving, but he also trimmed government spending by $720 million in just 2 years. With his experience as mayor, he wasn't afraid to delve into the details of the budget. He rolled up the sleeves and got involved. That was his trademark. The only thing he knew better than his budget, by the way, was his constituents. He helped hundreds of thousands of people who were stuck on welfare to find jobs as unemployment in Ohio fell to 25-year lows. He modernized our roads and bridges. He was a big infrastructure guy. And after a landslide re-election, he left the Buckeye State with nearly $1 billion in a rainy day fund. By the way, when he was mayor, he served as president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. And when he was governor, he served as president of the National Governors Association. The only person in America ever to have done that. Pretty amazing. He rose to the top. He loved to fish. Walleye fishing in Lake Erie was his favorite thing. He got me started on that, which I now do every year. He loved his lake. And if you go to his home today, as I did over the weekend, he's a couple houses from the lake, and you can see how proud he was of that lake by the way in which he supported efforts to make it clean and make it safe. He was also a strong supporter of our coal miners in eastern Ohio, and he became the first government executive in the world to recognize the independence of his ancestral homeland of Slovenia, something that meant a lot to George. His last speech was on Friday night last week, and it was on Slovenia Independence Day, 25-year anniversary. He was reelected as governor in 1994 with 72% of the vote, at the time the biggest landslide of any governor in Ohio history. After he had reached his term limit as governor, he was elected by another large margin to this chamber, the United States Senate. He was reelected in 2004 with more votes than any Senate candidate had ever received in the state of Ohio. In the Senate, he focused on expanding NATO, to include Slovenia. He authored a federal law that helps monitor and fight anti-Semitism all around the world. He passed bipartisan legislation to help protect American intellectual property. But if you want to see his biggest impact, go to Ohio. And you'll see it everywhere, whether it's the Interbelt Bridge that's named after him, whether it's the Voinovich Bicentennial Park in Cleveland, whether it's the Voinovich School of Leadership and Public Affairs at his beloved Ohio University in Athens, Ohio, whether it's the Voinovich Atrium at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which, by the way, some say would not be in Cleveland but for George Voinovich's leadership. I just talked last week to the director of the Hall of Fame, who happened to be here. The Rock Hall of Fame was here for a visit, and coincidentally, we talked about George Voinovich's role. and being sure the financing was put together to have that Rock and Roll Hall of Fame be in Cleveland, Ohio. These are all a testament to the love and respect the people of Ohio had and continue to have for him. Above all, talk to those who knew him. He made an impact on all of us. For me, he was a friend. He was a great mentor over the years, helped me in my career, was someone who gave me a lot of inspiration to get into public service in the first place. In our conversations, by the way, for all of his political successes and accomplishments and all we had to talk about that had to do with policy or political issues, he mostly wanted to talk about family. That's where he'd always start. That was what was in his heart. He'd say, "How's family?" That's how we'd start the conversations. Janet was his soulmate, his partner in everything, and he loved those kids and grandkids so much. They were the anchor for everything, family and faith. And that's one reason he was so successful in my view. He had grit. He had that work ethic. He certainly had natural talents, but he also had that foundation. And that moral foundation of his family and his faith gave him the confidence and the ability to do so many other great things for so many other people. When he announced his retirement, he said, "I have a philosophy. It's God, family, country, and community." Pretty good priorities. George put himself last. It was never about him. It was about others. He was the public servant. He put the servant part first. He had the heart of the servant because he was a humble man. As some know back home, he was proud of the fact that he drove a Taurus, he shined his own shoes, he was a penny pincher, he loved to buy his clothes on sale, he was a good fiscal conservative. He and Janet lived in the same house they bought in Cleveland in 1972. No matter where he was, what his title was, he was in many respects still that same kid from Collinwood, George from Collinwood. He was a man of deep faith. He was a devout Catholic, and as busy as he went to Mass several times a week. He also took comfort in praying the Rosary. Legendary quarterback Bernie Kosar tells a story that George Voinovich prayed the Rosary at Municipal Stadium with Bernie's mom during the Browns' 1986 double overtime comeback playoff victory over the New York Jets. So everybody gives Bernie Kosar all the credit for that. It really is George Voinovich and a higher power that intervened. After retirement, he did not slow down. As I said, just this past Friday, he was at Cleveland City Hall for the 25th anniversary of Slovenian independence. He was also at the Republican headquarters in downtown Cleveland last Thursday to open what we call the Voinovich lobby of that new headquarters. He was also planning to serve as a delegate to next month's Republican National Convention. We were so looking forward to paying tribute to him in many ways at that convention. We still will. But, I wish that he was going to be there to be part of it. It's been a great honor to succeed him as a United States Senator. When he decided to retire, he called me here to Washington. I'll never forget the dinner we had together where he said, "I'm not telling anybody this yet, but I'm planning to not run again for re-election." Incidentally, I had just helped him with an event in Ohio. I was strongly supporting him for re-election. But he said he'd had it. It was time for him to go back home. He encouraged me to run. He endorsed me the day I got in. I don't believe I would be here but for the fact that he called me to Washington that day and encouraged me and told me that knowing public service was in my heart too, that this was a time to step forward and to help our country. I owe him for so much, but most importantly for his model and for his example that he set. He was certainly an independent voice, including on this floor. Senators on both sides of the aisle will tell you that he was an attentive and thoughtful listener. He treated people with respect and dignity. I talked to some of the staff here this week about George Voinovich, and some who have been here a while and remember him all have the same thing to say. They cherished his friendship. They felt like he cared about them. He had good friends, Senator Shaheen and Senator Cardin on the other side of the aisle, good friends on this side of the aisle. He used to refer to Danny Akaka as being like a brother to me, who was a member from Hawaii on the other side of the aisle. His selfless example of public service, his ability to enact change on a bipartisan basis, I think does provide a lesson for us right now, and really for all time. I think we can best honor him by carrying on that tradition, by figuring out how to solve problems, and that involves reaching across the aisle and getting things done. He was a man who believed that we could make a difference here in this place. And Majority Leader McConnell has now joined us on the floor. Majority Leader McConnell will tell you that George Voinovich always had that belief that things could be better. He was ultimately an optimist. And his ability to figure out how to get to a solution was something that all of us can learn from. In Ohio, he was a public servant without equal. Tonight, I would like to offer a resolution honoring his memory. I urge all my colleagues to support it. I would like to ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to consideration of SRES 493, which we submitted earlier today.
The clerk will report.
Senate Resolution 493, relative to the death of George V. Voinovich, former United States Senator for the state of Ohio.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and that the motions to reconsider be considered and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President.